Hello, and welcome to the PowerPoint before Class 3, where we will talk about the broad topics of justice, health, and human rights, and relate it to the knowledge we need for ethics in the essentials of public health. Our objectives in this PowerPoint and in class are to talk briefly about the history and basis for human rights, in particular as they relate to medicine and the principle of justice. We will define distributive justice and discuss its challenges. Specifically, how does one decide how to distribute resources fairly? We'll list options for determining the macro and micro allocation of resources. You'll be able to state the difference between equality and equity, and recognize factors in the causation of health disparities, including poverty and racism. So, what are human rights, and from where do they derive? Do you think about the Declaration of Independence and its unalienable rights? Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? Do you think about human rights violations? We learned earlier in the course about clear violations of human rights in the Holocaust and the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, and about trying to protect autonomy through reforms in research. Is respect for persons a universal human right? What about the basic needs of food, water, shelter? How about freedom from oppression? Do you think health is a human right, or how about access to health care? Do rights differ based on where you are coming from? I'm sure we could each come up with somewhat different lists of what we each believe are essential human rights. In thinking about human rights, one guide we can use is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This document was crafted by the United Nations just after World War II and was a collaborative effort of the member nations in reaction to the atrocities of war. It was intended to be, as its title states, a universal declaration, and therefore to apply to all nations. You can read the actual wording in your optional readings for this class. It's not very long. I'll mention a few interesting points from the articles contained in the declaration here. It does list as human rights life, liberty, and security of person. No pursuit of happiness here. Freedom of thought, conscience, religion, opinion, and expression. Equal pay for equal work is in there, and a right to education. As it relates to health, which is our main concern today, it states, everyone has the right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of himself and his family, including food, clothing, housing, and medical care, and necessary social services, and the right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond his control. So, do you think we have that here in the U.S., or how about other countries? This declaration is looking at health broadly, and looking at what we think about now as the social determinants of health, which I'll talk about in a minute. First, let's take a step back and ask, what is health? Are we talking about lack of illness, or something more broad? One accepted definition comes out of the World Health Organization's founding charter from 1946, and defines health as a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. And it goes on to say, the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of health is one of the fundamental rights of every human being, without distinction of race, religion, political belief, economic, or social condition. Now, most of us probably feel we're fairly healthy, but a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being I'm not sure I've really ever experienced. So this statement is obviously aspirational, but that's good. We need to know what we're aiming for and think about how in our roles as physicians, and I would argue as citizens, we can promote health. These documents, while intended to be universal and foundational, are not binding laws, of course. We haven't gotten there yet. But many of their elements, such as the prohibition against torture, have been incorporated into international treaties, of which each UN member has at least signed one. The reason to talk about these foundations in this class is so we can think more clearly about the principle of justice, which I'll talk about next. As we defined before, justice is the principle of fairness. In healthcare, it can best be summed up by the expectation that similar situations will be handled in similar ways. If you walk into the emergency room with a cough, you would expect to be seen and evaluated before the person who walks in with the same complaint an hour later, all things being equal. Distributive justice refers to this principle and applies it to the allocation of resources to a group or a population in a fair manner. In that emergency room, there may be reasons for someone to jump ahead of you in line. The person who comes in with the acute, crushing substernal chest pain cannot wait, and so they would be triaged to be seen immediately. Another name for this triage, based on individual patient circumstances, is the micro-allocation of resources. We also talk about macro-allocation, which is distribution of resources on a broader population level. This would include topics such as what health policy decisions can a government make to increase access to donor organs for transplantation. How we as individual physicians or as larger organizations or governments make these kinds of decisions is based on striving to maintain the principle of justice or fairness in allocation, bearing in mind the overall goal of respecting human rights and promoting health. So how do we decide how to allocate resources fairly? The first thing to recognize is that resources are limited. We know that the amount of health care we can provide is not infinite. A single physician can only see so many patients at one time. A government will eventually exhaust the monetary resources it has available to fund health care, or other areas of government may suffer. So given that there are limits, how do we decide who gets what? In the triage example, there may be compelling reasons, a life-threatening emergency, for one patient to get quicker care than another, but most of us would be accepting that this was a situation in which we would need to wait our turn. We would get the care we needed eventually. But what about if there was no eventually? If you weren't able to afford health care insurance coverage or out-of-pocket expenses? Is that fair? We know that people without health care coverage don't do as well. They're more likely to postpone needed care due to costs. Only about a third of them get preventive care. Here in Massachusetts, we're very lucky that most patients do have some health insurance coverage, but it does not extend to everyone and does not cover everything, so cost can still be a barrier. Thinking about how to distribute healthcare as a resource, there are many ways in which you could slice it. Should it be market forces? Whoever can pay can get the care. This is how we organize many services in this country, and maybe healthcare should be one of them. Or should care be distributed equally, like everyone gets a set amount of money to spend on healthcare? This seems fair and might help certain populations, but the company CEO who makes over $1 million may not need it, while the poor person may appreciate it, but it might not be sufficient to get the care that they need. Or should we attempt some other form of equitable distribution based on need, for example? Those who have the greatest need for health care or the least amount of resources should get the highest amount of money. Or perhaps it is those who contribute the most to society or have the most promise of contributing who should get the most care, the young medical student over the retired factory worker. Or maybe it's most fair not to decide at all and to have a lottery. Whoever's picked will get the resources regardless of their situation. Which of these is most fair, and then who gets to make this decision? This may seem very abstract, but we'll talk in a minute and in class about some real-life examples. First, I mention here the concepts of equality and equity. We sometimes hear these words used interchangeably, or hear people speak of equality as the ideal, but these terms are different. Equality means that everyone gets the same thing, an equal amount. Equity has to do with fair, but not necessarily equal distribution. While equity may be a goal of healthcare or treatment in healthcare, equality of health is really unattainable because there are things that we cannot change. Genetics or age, for example, we've yet to figure out how to alter. Equality in distribution is possible. We can give everyone the same, an equal amount. Equity, though, refers to fairness in that distribution. The goal with equity is to get everyone what they need to succeed, not necessarily an equal amount. The example of a track race is often given to illustrate this concept. The track is round, so people running on the inside lanes have less distance to go around than people on the outside lanes. If everyone began at the same point, equally, then those on the inside would have an unfair advantage. So starts are staggered to make the distance each runner needs to travel the same. Because the paths they will travel are different, in order to give each runner a fair chance to win, adjustments need to be made. Another example is this picture from the Portland, Oregon Office of Equity and Human Rights website. You can see that with the same number of boxes for each, not everyone has an optimal experience. They aren't all starting from the same point. Height in this case is different. They don't all have the same need. Yet using the same resources and distributing them differently in the second picture, they all get a good view. This relates to the topic of health disparities, which we define as a particular type of health difference that is closely linked with social, economic, and/or environmental disadvantage. We aren't all starting from the same place in life. There are many factors which affect our starting point and where we end up. Social determinants of health play a role in access to and quality of health and health care. For example, socioeconomic status, where you live, race, ethnicity, all can affect health and contribute to healthcare disparities. There are efforts to define and address disparities, which you may have heard about or will hear more about soon. One example is the Healthy People 2020 initiative from the Government Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion, which has as its express goal to, by the year 2020, achieve health equity, eliminate disparities, and improve the health of all groups. To that end, the CDC and other agencies periodically report on existing disparities. I've put a link here to their 2013 Health Disparities and Inequalities report that you can look at. Just a few examples that I'll highlight from the report using their terminology. In terms of disparities, non-Hispanic blacks have an over 50% higher risk of premature death due to heart disease or stroke versus non-Hispanic whites. Diabetes prevalence is higher in most minority populations than it is in Asians and whites, and also higher in those with less than a college education or with lower incomes. And finally, infant mortality rates for blacks is double that of whites and is higher in the South and Midwest than in other areas of the country. These are just a few examples. There are many more. But just to keep in mind that there are many factors to consider as we talk about justice and the fair distribution of resources. So let's talk about practical applications a bit, looking at organ transplantation in the U.S. There are over 100,000 people on waiting lists for organs in the U.S. and around 30,000 transplants performed a year, roughly. There are not enough organs for everyone who could benefit from one. About 21 people each day are said to die while waiting for organs. This is definitely a limited resource. So how do we best decide who should get an organ? What we've done is to create networks across the country for organ procurement and distribution. The United Network for Organ Sharing and Organ Procurement and Transplantation Network divide the U.S. into 11 regions and even smaller donor service areas. Patients who need organs are matched with donors as organs become available based on donor or patient characteristics, such as their size, the organ size, blood type, and age. Location of the donor organ plays a role, especially for organs that cannot survive long outside the body, like the heart. And other factors depending on which type of organ may play a role, such as how sick the patient is or how long they've been on a waiting list. There have been many ethical concerns with the current system, some of which are outlined in the text as well as the optional readings. The New England Journal of Medicine commentary describes the issue of geography as destiny in transplantation and gives the example of Steve Jobs, who you may know as one of the founders of Apple. When he needed a liver transplant, he didn't just register himself in his home state of California, where people wait on average 6 years for a liver. Given his considerable wealth, he was able to register himself in other locations in the country, where organs for transplantation tended to be more available. He ended up receiving his liver in Tennessee, because he got the call that there was a liver match available for him and was able to board a private plane to get there in time. Now, financial considerations and location are not taken into account in the wait lists that are made, but you can see that someone with greater resources can find a way to increase their chances of survival. There's much debate about how to reform the system to increase access to organs for all, either by transporting patients or organs farther than we do right now. Also, there are moves to take into account the life expectancy of a recipient and an organ when making a match. The kidney allocation system just recently changed to score both donor and recipient to match those that had the greatest chance of surviving the longest. This will help avoid older people getting young kidneys that could live even longer than them, and help younger people from possibly needing retransplantation. This is a complex topic, obviously. We could try to solve this problem maybe in a different way, by increasing the amount of organs available. With more organs, there wouldn't be as much of an issue with distribution of a scarce resource. But how should we do that? Is it okay to pay people for their organs? Live donors of livers or kidneys could be paid directly for their organ, or we could find money to give to families for their donor organs of their deceased loved ones. In some countries, this is legal, but not in the U.S. It's okay to reimburse for expenses of the act, like the surgery or time lost from work, but not for the organ itself. There are a number of issues with paying people directly for organs, like how can we really be sure there's no coercion involved, particularly of the poor? Should we perhaps then make organ donation an expectation of everyone, something you need to opt out of at death, or else your organs would be harvested? They aren't doing you any good anymore, so why not? Should we require everyone to have an organ donor card stating their wishes? We do try to tie this to driver's licenses here, but perhaps we could expand upon that. There are many ideas we could think of. I'm sure you could think of more, but thinking carefully about how to do it with attention to issues of justice and fairness is required. We'll have time to talk in class and in our small groups much more about these ideas as we work through another example of scarcity and allocation of resources. I'll leave you today with the words of Martin Luther King concerning injustice in healthcare. If you do have time and are interested, I'd recommend reading the optional readings on organ transplantation and hemodialysis in the U.S. And as always, if you have any questions, please feel free to email me. Otherwise, I'll see you in class.